Okay, Boker Tov. Today's daf is Ayin Zayin 77, and we are going to catch up today. If you can see by just looking at Ayin Zayin, but we pick up at the top of Ayin Vav Amud Bet 76b, and we're dealing with three possible answers to the question that the Gemara asked, which is, according to Rabbi Shimon, you steal a cow or a sheep from the owner, and he's chayav b'chiyus, and he has to replace it. It's a chatas that he has to bring, or he took a neder, and therefore, because he has to replace it, even though it's kachim, it's considered like it's his, and because he'll suffer the loss when it's gone. So therefore, you have to pay him kefil. All is well and good. Then, though, you go ahead and you slaughter it, or you sell it, so you pay 4 and 5. Well, here's the problem: when you slaughter it, it cannot be eaten. It's kachim. It's either kachim slaughtered, well, we're assuming kachim slaughtered out of the base of mikdash. So, a sanctified dead animal is forbidden to derive benefit from. And Rabbi Shimon himself is the one that says that an act of shechita that does not make the meat permissible to be eaten is not considered an act of shechita. So how do you get the case of 4 and 5? So we basically have three answers, 2 variations of Rabbi Yochanan and then a Reish Lakish. Basically, Rabbi Yochanan answers are, you slaughtered it in the base of mikdash. Either you slaughtered it not for the sake of the owners, but then the Gemara's question is, but then you're not chayav, because then it was a way of giving it back to the owners. So the Gemara says, okay, but that's what purpose you did it, but then the blood was spilled. So in the end, the owners never got credit for it in the Beis HaMikdash. So it turns out that it was a continued act of Geneva, but because of the act of slaughtering, basically, in the end, the goal was for the blood to be sprinkled, or thrown, I should say. So then it was a shechita ru'uya, a shechita that would have made, at least had the potential of making the meat permissible. So that's exactly what we're about to explore. The other answer, according to Rabbi Yochanan, maybe even an easier one, is you shechted it in the Beis HaMikdash, not for the sake of the owners. So then the owner doesn't get credit because it's not a returning to the owners, but the meat can be eaten because it's going to be eaten by the Kohanim, it'll be eaten by you who brought it, if it's a shlamim, and therefore it is a shechita ru'uya. Third explanation, so those are 2 variations of Rabbi Yochanan, 2 ways of bringing it in the Beis HaMikdash. And the third explanation is, according to Reish Lakish, that you shechted it out of the Beis HaMikdash, but it had a blemish. And because it had a blemish, well, first of all, you're not chayav for shchutei chutz because it's not royal lepetachol moed. You couldn't have brought it as a korban. But we don't really care whether you violated or not. I mean, God cares, but that's not our interest. Our interest is whether the meat could be eaten. And as we're about to see, the fact that it had a blemish means that it could be redeemed. You could redeem it because it was not, since it wasn't fit for going to the mizbeach, the altar, because of the blemish, it could be redeemed. Okay, and so that presumably is what makes the meat fit, its potential to be redeemed. So that's now what the Gemara is going to explore, that in at least 2 out of those 3 cases, either the blood was spilled or the blood could have been redeemed, it still, at the time you slaughtered it, wasn't fit to be eaten. It needed the blood to be thrown, it needed to be redeemed, and so on. So why does that still count as a good shechita? Yes, Mike.
What I find interesting here is clearly the Gemara is not considering this technically a gazul, in which case it would be a problem to begin with. It would not be all about L'Shem anything. It's fine, but nevertheless, it's like. But you're bringing it
for, but gazul is the psul of gazul for a korban. Is you steal it and you sanctify it. It can't be your korban. This is the owner's korban that somebody else is bringing for the owner.
Which I didn't ask him to do and don't want
I understand. You're right. It does not. That is the assumption that does not make it a gazul. I mean, it is a gazul, but it's not a gazul.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Correct. You're correct about that. Okay, so let's take a look at the Gemara. Okay, so we'll start from the top of Ayin Vav Amud Bet just to read the third answer I just said of the Reish Lakish answer. Reish Lakish Amar b'shochet balei mumim b'chutz. You shechted it out of the Beis HaMikdash. It's a bal mum, you're not chayav. But more importantly, because it's a bal mum, it could be redeemed, and therefore it's considered a shechita ru'uya. So Taiba, Rabbi Eliezer. Now, whenever I read the word Taiba, I always think it means like to be toheh, was astounded. The Rashi insists that the word here means he was smelled it. Okay, because from the word, like there's a Gemara toeh, bastiha, which basically means he was like what's going on here? Okay,
it doesn't pass the sniff test.
It doesn't pass the sniff test. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, he was trying to figure out, how does this make sense? Okay, 1 minute. How does this make sense? Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that you brought it as a korban in the Beis HaMikdash. Shechita materes, is it the shechita what makes the meat edible? You need the throwing of the blood. So it wasn't fit to be eaten at the moment of shechita. So still, why is it a shechita ru'uya? The Reish Lakish, according to Reish Lakish, Kamma Teres, if it's shechted as a balmum out of the base of Mikdash, is it the shechita that makes it permissible? Follow Pediyam Teres, you need it to be redeemed, otherwise it's kachim and it's also behana. Okay, now by the way, Tosfos says that the question of Zrika Materes, because just as in general, according to Rabbi Yochanan, when you shecht a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, is it considered a shechita re'uya because it doesn't have the blood thrown? So a lot of these big Tosfos deal with the case of, let's say, there's an isser, otoves beno losi shchetu b'yom echad. You can't shecht a mother and a child, calf, or whatever, sheep on the same day. Let's say I do, and I shecht the child sheep. I shechted the mother earlier today, and the child I bring to as a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, and I shechted in the Beis Hamikdash. So we just say, oh, shechita shein re'uya. Because at the moment you shechted it, you couldn't eat the meat because you didn't throw the blood yet, right? So Tosfos says, no. If eventually you throw the blood, then of course it was a shechita re'uya. The question in the Gemara here is not this answer of Rabbi Yochanan that was brought shelo l'shem bailim. If the blood is thrown, then we retroactively look back and we say the shechita was part of the process of making it mutter, and eventually it did become mutter. The question is the scenario that the blood was spilled, or the scenario that it was shechted out of the Beis Hamikdash. In that case, the meat never became permissible, okay? And since it never became permissible, okay, and it's too late now to throw the blood, it's spilled, and Tosfos assumes it might also be too late to redeem it. That's an interesting question. Can you redeem an animal that was once living that's now dead? It's a whole question which I don't want to get into. But anyway, that's what Tosfos says the real question is. It's too late to do anything about it, and therefore it was not, the shechita didn't matter. Okay, but if you did throw the blood eventually, then Tosfos would say, well, then that's more obvious that would be okay. All right, yes.
But I understand why we need to say what happens in the end. At the moment you're doing it,
I understand, but Tosfos is trying to deal with other Gemaras. Then you would say a shechita's kachim is never considered a shechita re'uya.
No, I would say it always is, because as long as there's no other ma'akev beforehand, then
but you need the blood to be thrown. Every kachim you need the blood to be thrown. So you're basically agreeing with Tosfos, right? It's only a problem when blood wasn't thrown. Okay. Anyway, so the Gemara isn't clear about that. Rashi assumes it's a question either way. All right. But so number one, it needs a second act. So maybe that alone is enough to say it should not be a shechita re'uya, or minimally, or certainly it's a problem when it's too late to do that second act. Okay, when the second act wasn't done and maybe can't be done. So how can you say it was a shechita re'uya? All right. So the Gemara says, so Ishtamitete, he forgot. Had Rabbi Shimon, what the teaching of Rabbi Shimon, again, it's also another Rabbi Shimon, so it's all these Rabbi Shimons coming together. The Rabbi Shimon says, anything that was fit for having the blood thrown is like it was thrown. And this is going to be, now there's always a question, whenever you say kol ha'omed, is it like X happened? What do we mean it's like that X happened? So you mean like, oh, okay, so I brought my korban even without getting the blood thrown on the altar because it was fit for having it done. Like, no, of course not. Like, you need to throw the blood to get kapara. But what it means here in all the cases we're going to be looking at are basically exactly the same question. Can I view it as if the meat is fit to be eaten? Okay, so it's not a question of was I yotze my obligation. Let's say, for example, let's read the next line. If it was fit for the blood to be thrown, it was like it was thrown. The kol only liftot, it was fit for the animal to be redeemed. It's like it was redeemed. Now, it doesn't mean that literally. If I didn't redeem it and I got benefit from it, I would be chai for ne'ilah. I got improper benefit from hektish. If I didn't throw the blood, just because I could have thrown the blood, I didn't get atonement. My korban wasn't brought. But what it means is specifically in the scenario of, do I consider this meat as being considered roy la'achila? Right? Even though the word roy is a hypothetical, right? Is it fit to be eaten? Fit? Well, theoretically it was fit because you could have done something to have made it fit. So if it's considered to be a good shechita to have made the meat fit, if there was a scenario where it should have had the blood thrown, it should have been redeemed, and that would have made it fit, that's considered to be a good shechita. Okay, so let's take a look. Okay, Titania. Now, where do you see this in Rabbi Shimon? By another halacha, that's to define the food as considered to be food. One way we want the meat to be food is to be a good shechita. The other way we want meat to be considered food is the question of, is it mekabel tumah? If something tamei touches it, it only becomes food. It only gets tuma if it's considered to be food. So let's take a look. Titania, we talk in the Brayzer. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Yesh notar shehu metamei tumat ochlim. There's a type of a notar, leftover meat of a sacrifice, that can have the tuma of food stuff. And there's a type that cannot. And basically the difference is that is it fit to be eaten? Now, when something actually becomes notar, the mitzvah, what's the mitzvah to do with meat that's notar, that's left over? Burn it. Burn it. Okay. Anyway, that's everybody get that. Anybody get that reference? No. Okay, fine. I'll tell you afterwards. Anyway, so that's not fit to be eaten. But meat doesn't start its life as notar. First, it's like korban meat, and then you left it over too long. So he says, in a scenario where the meat could have been eaten before it became notar, even though now it's notar, it's still considered food. If it started its life as being edible. But if it did not start its life as being edible, then it's not food. Similar idea to what he says about shechita, right? Shechita isn't shechita unless it makes the meat edible. Meat is not considered food unless the meat was edible. But as long as it was edible at the beginning of its life, it's considered food. Well, let's take a look at the case, okay? So he says, Ketzad, what's the case? Lan lifnei zrika, if the meat slept over, meaning it waited too long, the night passed, and you didn't throw the blood, then the blood was never thrown. It was never fit to be eaten. So it's not food and doesn't get the tumah food stuff.
And it can't tell me something else.
Exactly. La'achar zrika, if it's after zrika, then it was fit to be eaten. So even though now it no longer is because it's notar, it does have the tumah food stuff. Okay. But that itself doesn't tell like if kol haroy. But then the Gemara says, but this is a statement that we've analyzed elsewhere, and we've analyzed it elsewhere. Here's the conclusion we've reached. The kaimalan, we have concluded regarding this statement. Ma'ilifnei zrika. What does it mean that it became notar before the blood was thrown? Or it means kodem shenir el zrika, before it ever became fit for having the blood being thrown. La'achar zrika, if it became notar after the blood was thrown, does not mean the blood literally was thrown. It means la'achar shenir el zrika. If as long as there was a moment where the blood could have been thrown, then it's considered already to be food and can become tameh. What would be the scenarios? It was never fit. It was fit. Kodem shenir el zrika lan mahi. What's a case where it stayed overnight before it was ever fit to have the blood thrown? Lo had yeshos biyom lemizrake. There wasn't time to do this rika in the day. The shachte samach l'shkias achama. You shechted it a minute before nightfall. Okay, before sunset, and you could only throw the blood and do the avod in the mikdash while it's still daylight. So by the time you caught the blood, there was not mamish. The clock struck 12 or 6 or whatever it struck the moment the blood was caught. So there was not a moment to throw the blood on the altar. And in that case, and then the night passed, so the meat slept over the night without it ever having even had an opportunity to have the blood being put on the altar. That's a case where it's not food. It never even could have had the blood thrown. 1 minute.
So it's a hypothetical case. They're never cutting it.
Obviously. Okay. Now. If it was after it was fit, the having shows beyond the mitzvah. Okay, you shechted it not a minute before nightfall, not a minute before sunset. So you have the opportunity to throw the blood. Because you have the opportunity to throw the blood, even if you never did, it's as if you threw the blood for the purpose of saying this meat, in theory, was fit to be eaten. And since in theory it was fit to be eaten because you could have thrown the blood, now it's fit to become get the tumah of foodstuffs. In that case, mitami tumah's olim. It can get the food tumah. Alma, you see from this, kol omed lizro kizaruk dami. It's like the blood was thrown again. Not like the blood was thrown, like you get atonement for your sacrifice, but because it had that opportunity, it's considered as if theoretically that it could have been edible, and that makes it considered food, and it can get the tumah of food.
And that's why it is.
And that's why the same way, and it's a very similar. It's not the exact same. That's not defining shechita. That's defining food, but it's very similar because the goal of shechita re'uya is to say you may turn this thing into edible meat. So therefore, since the blood could have been thrown, even if a minute later it was spilled, if at the time of shechita it was theoretical to be thrown, that's as if the meat is edible for the purpose of food stuff, and as if the meat is edible for defining it as a shechita re'uya. So you can have a scenario of spilling the blood and nevertheless be chai for arba v'chanisha because it could have been thrown. That's enough to define it as a shechita re'uya. Yes, Charlie.
2 questions. You shuck the animal, you sprinkle the blood, and then, so in theory it's fit to eat, but then you discover it's a treifa.
Yeah, well, that's
was it
not
ever really fit to eat?
No. No, then it's not a shechita. That would be a perfect example of a shechita she'ena ruya, because then it was never.
Second, the second case where you shecht it right before the end of the day.
Right.
That in practice, that would seem to be only possible with the korban pesach, because normally the last korban would be the korban tamid.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Although b'diavad, if you got out of order, it's still kosher. But that's a good point. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay, so that's the case that the blood should have been thrown. Now. That defines it as fit to be eaten, the meat. And now we're going to say the same thing about the Reish Lakish's answer, what was a Baal Mum shechted out of the Beis HaMikdash, where even if you never redeemed it, and maybe according to Tosfos you're not even able to redeem it after it's dead, because it was fit to be redeemed, that also makes it considered to be food, okay, and a good shechita, okay. Where do you get this? Titani, we turn an advisor. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says, notice how it's all Rabbi Shimon. It's beautiful. All the Rabbi Shimons are coming together. Okay? Para matami tumas ochlin, hol v'haisala shasa kosher. So now you can just remember those 8 words, and you can learn an amud of Gemara every second. Okay, so anyway, a para duma, okay, which by the way, interestingly, a para duma is considered kache bedakavai is not kache mizbeach because it's not actual korban, although it's similar to a korban. It's a fascinating sort of hybrid status of the para duma. Okay, and the question is, same question of tumas ochlin. Can it get the tuma of food stuff? If something tamei touches it, will it become tamei? Now, if you're wondering what this huge toast is about,
would you be able to use it for chatas?
No, that's not so much the question as whether just it becomes tamei, will transfer the tumor, whatever. It's not about it.
Okay, because you're not eating it anyway.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, if you're wondering what this huge toast is about, I'll just tell you. One of the things this huge toast is about the fact that 1 minute. I thought a paratuma causes people to become tamei. It itself is a source of tumor. Mm-hmm. So if a paratuma is itself a source of tumor, why does it have to talk about a scenario where it gets tumor from the outside? Okay, so Tosfos tries to work through that. But the simple answer is that it's only a source of tumor if you're involved in the process of making it into the ashes and so on, not just simple touching would not be a source of tumah. But anyway, so can a para aduma that was shechted be considered food? Okay, now again, the meat is never meant to be eaten. It's not like bringing a korban in the Beis HaMikdash where you or the kohanim will eat the meat. It's meant to be burned. Okay, it's kudshim. You're not allowed to eat kudshim. So when is it ever considered food? How could it be considered food to get tumas ochlin? So it says it can get tumas ochlin. Why? What's the scenario that it could be eaten? However, shasa kosher. It had a moment where it could have been eaten. What was that moment? So we're going to explain. Turn the page. The Amar Reish Lakish said Reish Lakish. Omer Hay Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon, again, notice it's again a Reish Lakish and Rabbi Shimon, it's all the same players. Rabbi Shimon used to say, para niftes al gabe ma'arachta. A para could be redeemed even you have the dead carcass sitting on top of the pyre, right? You know, the pile of wood, you're about to light it, you're about to start burning it, okay? And the moment before you start burning it, you could decide, you know what? It's sort of like, we should do this better. Like, I found it better, paraduma. Maybe I didn't have the right kavanas. I'm just teasing about that. Anyway, so let's go ahead. We'll redeem it. We'll start the whole process again. Even up to the last minute. Now, Tosfos says, presumably we're talking before you did this Rika Saddam. Like, once you did this Rika Saddam, that's it. But okay. But almost up to the last minute, you can redeem it and start the process again. Okay, so there you go. It's fit to be redeemed. So the fact that it's fit to be redeemed, even though there's no mitzvah to redeem it, and this way it's a bigger chiddush than this Rika Saddam, because there is a mitzvah to throw the blood of a korban. But here there's no mitzvah to redeem it. It's just in theory you could redeem it. It's enough to make the thing considered to be food. Since it had a moment where it could have been redeemed and it could have been edible, after it was shechted, it's food and it can become tamei. And similarly, when I shecht this Baal Mum, this animal with a blemish outside the Beis HaMikdash, for a shlukish, that is considered a shechita re'uya because the food in theory could be eaten if I were to just redeem it. Okay? Alma, you see, kohom in liftos kipadri dami, anything that's fit to be redeemed is like it was redeemed. See, that was such an easy Gemara. No, I'm serious. Like, conceptually, what we just read is not hard. We are compared to stuff we've been dealing with. But Tosfos, has these big other questions that are not relevant to us. So it makes today's daf an easy one. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Beach Lema
As
Rabbi
you said, you
Yochanan.
have to worry when there's a big Rashi.
Exactly. Big Tosusim, you often do not have to worry. Beach Lema, and not only that, relative to other Tosusim, those are not hard Tosusim. I mean, you know, it sounds counterintuitive, but anyway, just long. Beach Lema Rabbi Yochanan, Lamak Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Now the Gemara's got it. I got now the pshat of why this Shchitas question you're high 4 and 5 is either it was a korban brought in the base of Mikdash, or it was Baal Mum shechted outside. In theory, it could have been eaten if you would have thrown the blood or redeemed it. Shchita Reuya. Now let's figure out why Rabbi Yochanan didn't give Reish Lakish's answer and vice versa. B'Yishleima Rabbi Yochanan lo amak Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan didn't say Reish Lakish that it was a Baal Mum shechted out of the base of Mikdash.
He always disagreed.
The Kabbai lu'ukma masis and afilu b'tmimim. He didn't want to limit our Mishnah to a case of Baal Mum. He wouldn't disagree with Reish Lakish. Sure, if it was a Baal Mum, that would also be a scenario, but I don't want to limit our Mishnah to that case. A Mishnah could apply even if the animal was unblemished and you brought it in the base of Mikdash. Ella Reish Lakish, my time along with Rabbi Yochanan. Why did Reish Lakish not give Rabbi Yochanan scenario? An unblemished animal brought in the base of Mikdash. Amalekah, he'll say to you a new point about Tvich and Mechira. With Tvacho o Mecharo, you slaughter it or you sell it. You're only chayav for shechting it if you could have been chayav for selling it, and vice versa. If you can't be chayav for selling it, you're not chayav for shechting it. So what does that mean? It means an unblemished animal you can't sell, right? Because selling, if I were to try to sell my korban to Charlie here and it was unblemished, it wouldn't be a sale. He can't take possession of it. If it was blemished, I could sell it. Because the act of selling, the money he gives me, could be an act of transferring the kedusha to the money. And because
is that the way it works automatically?
I'm not exactly sure, but anyway, but at least in theory, it's possible. Okay, certainly you could say that that's what you're doing, so therefore, since it could be sold, I'm chayiv. There's a scenario I could be chayiv for selling it. I'm chayiv for slaughtering it. But if it was unblemished and there was not a scenario where I could be chayiv for selling it, because no sale could take place, I'm not even chayiv for slaughtering it. So this is a new idea of tvich and mechira for Reish Lakish, that you have to be able to be chayiv for one to be chayiv for the other. These been kachim lo having mechira. If you try to sell a korban without a blemish, it's not a sale.
Oh, wait, I understand.
You're not chayiv to slaughter it. What?
It's not
I know, which is even funny.
Which is that I understand, but which means if anything, it's independent.
I understand, which is why it's funny that the Gemara had a vav in the our text of the Gemara, even though the side changes it back to the o. Yeah, I don't know exactly, but the fact that it's just talking about it in the same breath. But you're right. Exactly why it's seen as this tight connection, I don't know. Okay, that's what Rabbi Lakish. That's what Reish Lakish says, and the Gemara says, and guess what? We actually know that this is a debate of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, so it exactly parallels why they chose. Rabbi Yochanan chose to say Tmimin, and Reish Lakish says Baal Mum. We're not even making this up. Okay, this actually, they are known to have debated this question of is the chiyuv of shchita and mechira, do you have to be theoretically be able to be chai for one to be chai for the other? Dietmar was taught hamochet treifel. Let's have a flip case where you can't be chai for shchita. Could you be chai for mechira? You sell an animal that's a treifa. Now, according to Reb Shimon, Charlie, you just gave his case, you can't be chai for shchita because the shchita will never make the meat edible. Good. So, according to Reb Shimon, are you chai if you sell it for 4 and 5? If you could never be chai for shechting it, okay. Hamochet treifa l'divrei Reb Shimon. If you're going to chayiv, you're still chayiv. Mechira, you're chayiv for shchita, you're not. Reish Lakish Amar Pater, you're exempt. If you're going to chayiv avagav the lesser betvicha, although you can't be chayiv for shechting it. Isa b'mechira, you're chayiv for selling. Reish Lakish Amar Pater, no, you're exempt. Even the lesser b'mechira, lesser b'mechira. If you can't be chayiv for one, you can't be chayiv for the other. In the kachim case of without a blemish, you're not chayiv for mechira, so therefore you're not chayiv for shchita. In this case, you're not chayiv for shchita, so therefore you're not chayiv for mechira. Okay, so the Gemara says, Eser Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan challenged Reish Lakish. Here we have a breita. Ganav kilayim, you stole a hybrid animal. An animal that was a cross between, Rashi says, what's kilayim? Rashi says, what does Rashi say? Mikivsa v'tayash. What's a tayash?
Tayash, right? Like a goat, right?
A goat? Oh, right, a goat. Okay, fine. Right, okay. Can you make a hybrid between a sheep and goat?
We looked at that when we were doing chulin. We discovered they've actually done that.
Okay, so an animal here is a crossbreed of a sheep and a goat. Okay, so now, God of Kilayim. Now, the funny thing here is, the reason that this is a chiddush to say you're chayav for shvita mechira is the Torah says, Ki novi shur oseh. So is this a seh? se includes a both like would a se include a goat, something that's a hybrid of a goat and a sheep. Okay.
We talked about this in Cooler.
Yeah, I know. So let's take a look. Okay, so it says Ganav kilayim, you stole a crossbreed, v'tvacha, and you slaughtered it, treifa umechara, or a treifa and you sold it. You pay 4 and 5. So yes, kilayim is considered a se. Okay, and selling a treifa, you're chayav, even though presumably, this is Rabbi Yochanan's question, why did it talk about selling a treifa? Because presumably, shechting a treifa, you'd be exempt. But selling a treifa, you're going to be chayav. So he says, my love, are we not talking Reb Shimon here? According to Reb Shimon. That's why it's a chiddush to say treifa. Alma, you see, avagav the less of the tvicha, even though you're not chai for shechting the treifa, isa b'mechira, you're chai for selling. Because obviously this is Reb Shimon. Why else would it say selling a treifa? Obviously that's the point. Amar leis, Reb Yochanan Udei Shakir says back, no, lo rabbanan, no, it's the rabbanan, and it says treifa because to tell you that they're not concerned with shchita sheina ruya. So Reb Shakir says 1 minute. Reb Yochanan says back, I rabbanan treifa b'mechira isa b'zvicha lesa. So he says, I don't get it. If it's the Rabbanan, why talk about just selling a treifa? Talk about shechting a treifa. It's a bigger chiddush, right? The elo. So he says back. So Shakir says back to him. Velamai. Reb Shimon, you want to say it's Reb Shimon, and that's why we talk about selling a treifa because shechting a treifa you're exempt. But if that's true, why when it gives the case of the cross street kilayim, why did it talk about shechting a kilayim? Why doesn't it talk about shechting or selling a kilayim? Betvicha isa b'mechira lesa. So look, this bright is weird because it only gives one scenario for each. It talks about shechting a kilayim or selling a treifa. So whatever you say about the treifa case, kilayim obviously it's the same whether you shecht it or sell it. So it's just picking one scenario for each, but it doesn't need to exclude the other scenario. Okay, so that's what Reish Lakish says. So he says, Ela tana tzvicha v'adin l'mechira. Okay, so therefore, you know what? Even if it were Reb Shimon, what was talking about the kilayim, it wouldn't be limited to shechting. It would need shechting or selling. So I'm going to say the whole bright is the Rabbanan. Tana mechira v'adin l'tzvicha, and it's not meant to say only this scenario. So the Breita says shechting kilayim or selling a treifa. So Rabbi Yochanan is certainly right. By talking about selling a treifa, it sounds like shechting a treifa, you'd be exempt. Selling a treifa, you're chayiv. But Reish Lakish says, look, it's a weird Breita because it only gives one scenario for each case. One scenario for kilayim and one scenario for treifa. So I'm going to say this whole Breita is Rabbanan, and it says one scenario, but it really means either scenario, which is a pretty weak answer, as Rabbi Yochanan is about to say. So the Gemara says back to him, "Hi, Mai, what type of an answer is that? If the Breita is Reb Shimon, I think the tani treifa b'chada, since the case of a treifa could only be one scenario, could only be the selling scenario, because the shechting scenario you're exempt. Tani kilayim b'chada. So once we're going to talk about a treifa by selling, because we have to be talking about a treifa by selling, a treifa by shechting your putter. So we're going to give the other case by the kilayim. We'll say, okay, a treifa by selling or kilayim by shechting. Now we got everything covered. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, why? Because we had to pick one case by the treifa. But if it's the Rabbanan, Narvina Benis new. It doesn't make any sense why we give them separate descriptions and we pick one for each one of them. Put it all in the same category. Ganav kilayim b'treifa. If you stole the kilayim or a treifa, tavchan u'mecharan, and if you shechted them or you sold them, mishan teshlum yarba v'chamisha. That's what it should have said. It is so bizarre that it separates them out and gives different scenarios. So the Gemara says, Kasha, fine, you're right. This price I don't have a good explanation about why it said it this way. I'm not conceding the point. I'm still going to say the Breita is talking according to the Rabbanan, but you're right. It's bizarre that it gives one scenario for the kilayim and one for the shechita. Not only that, what the Gemara should have made is even a stronger point, which is if there's no chiddush according to the Rabbanan about selling treifa. If it really was the Rabbanan, then it was going to pick one scenario by the treifa. It should have been shechting treifa. That's the chiddush, right? The Rabbanan disagree with Reb Shimon and say, even if the meat can't be eaten, you're chayav. So, why give the scenario of selling treifa, which isn't a chiddush at all, give the scenario of shechting the treifa. So Reb Yochanan is clearly right that the pshat of the Breita is that it's going according to Reb Shimon, and it's telling you that by a treifa, even though you'd be exempt by shechting it, you're chayav for selling it. So that's their debate about do you need to be able to be chayav one in order to be chayav the other. But now we've also introduced the kilayim issue. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about the kilayim, about the crossbreed. So let's take a look. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Kilayim, why are you chayiv by kilayim for what do you call it? For slaughtering or selling? Sexy. It says if a person steals a sheep. Okay. I'm a Rava, and Rava says Zebneyav. This is a paradigm. Excuse me. Kol makom shenemer seh. Anytime the Torah just says the word seh by itself. Hold on, let me just check Rashi a minute. Hold on a second. Okay, fine. And anytime it says the word "seh" by itself, the word "seh" by itself is meant to say not a crossbreed. So how can we say, okay, we've had a debate about whether in order to be chai for one, you have to be chai for the other, and that's a question about selling the treif according to Rabbi Shimon. But we can all agree that the Breita says you're chai for kilayim. Why is that? The Torah says seh, and Rava teaches us that anytime the Torah says seh, we should assume that a crossbreed is excluded. Okay, zeh lahotias kilayim. Shani hacha damar kra o. The Rava says kilayim. It says sure o seh. And that extra O, it seemed to be extra, comes to tell us it doesn't have to be exactly a seh, it could even be a crossbreed. So the Gemara says 1 minute. O, the Rabbi says, anytime it says the word O or a sheep or this animal, it's coming to mean even not exactly that animal, even some type of a crossbreed. But I'll show you the exact opposite. Vatanya, we taught in the Brisa, sure O kesev O eis ki yivaled, right? This is talking about a type of an animal that you bring, you wait for the 8th day to bring it as a korban, but it's basically also talking about what type of an animal can be brought as a korban. So it says, sure O kesev, an ox or a lamb, or sheep. Prat l'kilayim. So the O kesev is to exclude some crossbreed. Okay? O A's, sure O kesev O A's ki yivaled, an ox or a sheep or a goat if it's born. So what's the extra O teaching you about the ox? Prat l'nidmeh, to exclude a animal that even looks different. If it's born from 2 sheep and it looks like a goat, okay, even though it genetically is a sheep, nevertheless, that's also puzzle for a korban. That's even less than a kilayim. That just looks different. It's not actually a hybrid. Anyway, the point though being, the words O here, rather than broadening the category, are seen as explicitly excluding things that are not exactly these. Okay, so what's the story? Does O broaden and you're chayiv 4 and 5 for the case of stealing a hybrid? Or does O exclude, like by the korban, and you can't bring a korban from a hybrid? So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, what's the answer? It says Rava, in each case, we're interpreting the O based on the context in the pasuk. How is that true? When it comes by burglary, to see sure O seh, an ox or a sheep. If it would have said an ox and a sheep, okay, an ox and a sheep cannot crossbreed. Okay, a sheep and a goat presumably yes, but an ox and a sheep cannot. Okay, so by just saying ox and sheep, putting those words next to each other, implicitly it means no crossbreeds, because ox and sheep are not crossbreedable. So by talking about just those two, the implication would be no crossbreeds, because that's implicit about those two by themselves. So it would be true even about a crossbreed of a sheep and a goat. So that's if I would have just had them by themselves without the O. I would have said no crossbreeds. Okay. O l'rabo. So then comes the O. So the O is coming to tell me the opposite of what I assumed. Yes, crossbreeds. That's in the case of Geneva. O l'rabo's kilayim. Gabi kodshim d'chsiv kesev ve'ez. Had it just written a sheep and a goat, right? Because by kodshim it says sure o kesev o ez. By Geneva it just says sure o seh. And you can't crossbreed a sure and a seh. But by kodshim it says sure o kesev o ez. A sheep and a goat. And a sheep and a goat could be crossbred. So by having them juxtaposed, it would have suggested crossbreed, yes, because crossbreeds are possible. A crossbreed is possible with a sheep and a goat. I would have thought that, so because by themselves I would have thought, yes, crossbreeds, the O is coming to tell me the opposite. O l'mayitu. So the O is coming to tell me no crossbreeds. Okay? The funny thing about all of this is that what Tosas asks is that where do you ever use a Rava's principle that the word Se by itself excludes crossbreeds, because here it basically says, you go one way or the other, you're not clear where you start. In one case you start in one position, the other case you start in the other. Doesn't seem like there's any rule which is the default position. Okay, but anyway, the basic answer is that by Geneva we use the O to include crossbreeds, because we would have started with an assumption they're excluded, and by Kudshim we use the O to exclude them, and not only exclude crossbreeds, even exclude things that don't look like their parents, and that's because we would have started by assuming they were included. All right, so we're 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Let's get a little bit further.
We have to worry about Yom Kippur.
Oh my God, that's true. let's worry. You got a month to worry about that. So the Gemara says, okay, v'ha gabe kachim nami nemar shoro kesev. 1 minute. She'enot yochel hatzi kilai mibeneim. You can't. Why do you start by the kesev ve'ez, which suggests crossbreeds, and then the O tells you the opposite? Start by the beginning of the pasuk. The beginning of the pasuk says shor o kesev, and an ox and a sheep suggests no crossbreeds. So why not start there and say the O is coming to include? Right? Got it? Why start at the end of the pasuk and say the O is coming to exclude? Start at the beginning of the pasuk where it sounds like crossbreeds are excluded and say the O is coming to include. So the Gemara says v'narbi, and then we'll include crossbreeds. No, need to say for lemite, reishanam lemite. If you note, says well, if you start at the end, then the O is clearly coming to exclude. So the O in the beginning is also coming to exclude. And remember, what we excluded from the other O was a nidna, something that did not look like its parents. The Gemara says 1 minute. That's not an answer. Why start at the end and assume exclusion? Start at the beginning and assume inclusion. So the Gemara says, Adrabba, midureisha l'rabos. Let's start at the beginning. Say O is coming to include kilayim. And then say for now the rabbis, we'll use the O at the end to also be include more animals. It says, hi, Mike. What type of an answer is that? If you're saying the O is coming to exclude, who do you exclude? That's when you need to exclude twice. First, you exclude kilayim, a genuine crossbreed, and then you exclude from the other O even an animal that really is a purebred biological offspring, or whatever, just because it looks different. Okay, so just because you excluded the more severe case, you needed another O to exclude the less severe case. Okay, even though you've already excluded crossbreeds, because sure and A's implies yes crossbreeds, the O excludes them. It's strictly mute nidme. You need the other O to exclude an animal that doesn't look like its parents. But if you started by saying sure and kesev, it implies no kilayim. The O comes to include kilayim. Once you've included kilayim, what's left to include? Of course, an animal that's just looks different would be included if you're including a genuine kilayim. And if you start at the beginning of the pasuk and the O comes to include kilayim, why do you need to be more inclusive? What else is left to include after you've included kilayim? Hasha kilayim here, if you're including kilayim. So, you'll be like, nidme mi baya? Do you even need to include nidme? I mean, nidme is mamish, a purebred biological offspring. It just looks a little different. So if the O is already including, you're not going to need the other O. So clearly we're going to start at the end of the pasuk and say the O excludes kilayim, and then we'll need the other O to exclude not just a kilayim case, but even a nidme case. Okay. So then the Gemara is going to ask the question that I just said a minute ago, which is then whenever do you go by Rav that the default of the word "seh" means to exclude kilayim? Since here we didn't even start with the default. We started in one place, we assumed yes, one place no. Whenever does this default idea apply? We'll pick up with that tomorrow. So you get a little free time now today.
That's your clock.
Not only did we catch up, we got ahead.